It's always hard following the Malman women because they are amazing storytellers and gifted. And I have other talents. Most of them involve Cheetos. So it's a little tricky following them at times. It's been a kind of a roller coaster of a week for the Millers. Super excited to finally close on our house in Nebraska. And that was, thank you, Lord, for that. That was about 4.5 years faster than when we sold our last house, so we're super stoked about that and excited to soon be, I know we won't be Texans yet, but we will have residency in Texas soon, and so I know it takes a few decades to become a Texan, if it's possible, but pretty excited about that. Other exciting events from this week include this. So in the meantime, I don't think I've told all of you this, a lot of you know this, but in the meantime, we've been living with Patsy's daughter, Carolyn, and her husband, Bobby, and it's kind of neat because every once in a while, super things end up coming across my phone like, hey, we have some of Bobby's gumbo left over. You want to join us for gumbo tonight? And I know some of you have had that gumbo, and it is delicious. And so we were sitting at dinner one day this week, and Patsy says, Corey, I got to tell you a story. It's so cool. It's so neat what God does and how God is. And I never know what's going to follow that line from Patsy. I don't know if you've ever sat in on a Patsy story time before, but they're always very interesting, and I never quite know where they're headed. But when she lands the plane, it's always a beautiful thing. And she says, so this week I didn't get permission to tell this story. Can I tell the story about what you got in the mail this week? And if you say no, that's fine. It wasn't the Victoria's Secrets catalog or anything like that. But it was, she got this thing in the mail, and it was from a business. I don't know if she frequents it or not, but I don't think it's a big secret of the kind of places that she frequents. And so, anyway, this casino sends her a postcard, and the casino says, right on the front of the postcard, it says, what's your story? How cool is that, right? Isn't that awesome? So the next day, she goes up to her daughter's for a Bible study that her daughter hosts on, I think, Thursdays. And Patsy goes up to that Bible study, and she's sitting in the Bible study. And I didn't hear this story from Patsy. Well, I did hear this story from Patsy, but honestly, Patsy, I had heard it from Carolyn the day before. But Carolyn tells me this story, and I need to preface this with, I know that you haven't seen Patsy lately. It's good to have her back with us today. She hasn't been at the casinos, contrary to public opinion. She's actually been watching service at home. They battled a little bit of COVID in her family, so she was just being cautious. But it's great to have you back. But last week, she and her daughter and Bobby were watching our service at home. I think just to kind of make sure, she had heard rumors about a story I told about the possibility of her being pregnant at her 90th birthday party or something. And I think she was just kind of keeping up to make sure that I didn't get too far out of line with any of the stories. But anyway, Patsy tells me this story that Carolyn had told me the day before about their Bible study where this young lady, and by young, I actually mean like half the age of most of the people that attend the Bible study. This young lady, a young mom, at their Bible study says, I like watching the videos we watch, and I like studying the Bible, and I like doing our studies, but honestly, you know what would really be helpful to me? Guess what the next words out of her mouth were? If I could just listen to your stories. See, there's a theme that's running through, and if you watch close enough, this is very common. And I tend to think that when God gives me this great revelation that's just shows up in me about things that are connected to me, I think that's just about me, and maybe it's not for everybody else. So I don't tell you all the crazy things that he sends into my mind at times because I'm not always sure they're from him. However, when you see them repeated amongst believers and churches and throughout the kingdom, I get the impression that maybe God thinks we should tell our story. Just like this psalm that we've been working on, Psalm 107. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, and his love endures forever. I want to kind of give you an example today of what telling stories telling your stories can do for people. So I'm going to share with you a few of my stories. This is not going to be an expositional text, although I'm going to connect a lot of text to it because I am preaching, so I'd rather you hear from the Bible than me. But I also want to exhibit this trait of giving thanks to the Lord whose love, and by the way, remember what kind of love? The Hesed love. This steadfast love that doesn't give up, never lets go, okay? And one of the great things about stories for me, I don't know what part of the story you identify with. Some people love reading a story because of the setting. Some people love to read stories set in the Old West, for example, or they love to read a story in Europe. And they love to listen to the detail that comes out and all that you can learn about the culture and the setting. I tend to prefer stories with fantastic characters. And I mean real characters, like the two I grew up with in my house. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm the one on the left, and those are my two brothers. And all three of us have this disease that we still haven't shook of rooting for the Huskers. And it's an impossible thing to break loose of, but it's getting closer every day. I'm about to shake it, I think, after last night. But those are my brothers, and we're pretty close. I love those guys. Lee is the farthest one on the right. He's the oldest, as you can probably tell, because he has the most man hair. And then in the middle is my brother Rusty, and then I'm the one on the left, the youngest, because I still have my baby face. I won't tell you how long ago that picture was taken, by the way, but you'll notice I look more like Lee than me in that picture. But I was fortunate to grow up with brothers, and my mom was very fortunate not to have daughters. She would have loved to have had daughters, but there was one problem with that. God knew what he was doing when he didn't give my dad daughters, because the three boys barely survived, and our wives are heroes for the things that my dad says and does that just are not politically correct. He would be in prison if he were like still working somewhere today. Like the things he says and does, I don't know how you get an 80-year-old guy that doesn't remember that it's not okay to say certain things to people anymore. I don't know how you change that or stop that. I don't know that that's going to happen anytime soon. But those guys were characters, all three of them. And a lot of that came from their father. Fortunately, they weren't the only influence in my life. And so I want you to see this picture too with the next verse, which says, "Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story." Now, this is a great picture to me. It means nothing to you. But in the center of that picture is a tiny little baby boy by the name of Ian Michael Miller. Also in the picture, on the far left is Ian, and in the middle is Michael, and then that guy on the right is Miller. So those are my two best friends growing up, Ian and Michael, evidenced by the fact that I chose to name my kid after him. And they have been lifelong, loyal friends. As a matter of fact, when I read the Proverbs, which, by the way, I'm going to read a lot of Proverbs to you today, and I think you'll see that there's a common thread that runs throughout this book. But in Proverbs 13, verse 20, it says, "Walk with the wise and become wise. Associate with fools and get in trouble." And that picture and all the stories I'm going to tell you today represent that principle really, really well. I was very fortunate to have wise friends. They, on the other hand, were a little unfortunate and associated with fools. And most of these stories will illustrate that for you, because I was a young kid when I met these guys, and I did a lot of foolish things. But these are my other brothers. Some people would call them friends. And that's what I want to talk about today, is friendship. And the characters that God writes into our story that we can learn from. When I say that I was foolish, one of the reasons I think I was very foolish is I thought I had a lot to teach these guys. I was a young, arrogant, young guy. The truth is, my life is so much richer from these two men being in my life. I can't even begin to tell you, but I'm going to try. I want to tell you the first story that kind of illustrates that. And that first story happened about the time that we got our driver's licenses. And I don't know about you, but that was a great time in South Dakota. In South Dakota, you can drive at 14 legally. I told the story at Supper Club last week about, the fact that you can drive at 10 illegally. And sometimes the police will even let you go. That's a story for another day when there aren't children in the room that are thinking, hey, I think I should drive. But here's the thing. Mike, the guy in the center, he was a fantastic guy. Both these guys grew up on the East Coast. Mike grew up in New Jersey and moved just before middle school started to South Dakota. Ian grew up in just outside of the D.C. area and in Maryland, and again, right about middle school, moved to the Black Hills, literally the middle of nowhere, right? Or the middle of everywhere, as we in South Dakota like to think. But Mike didn't have a lot of knowledge about vehicles. I mean, Mike was the guy who, the very first day he got his driver's license, he backed his dad's pickup into his mom's Jeep. That's not a great start to driving. And so we didn't really let him down. Some of my favorite stories with Mike have to do with his great knowledge of cars. Now, I am not much of a mechanic, but I had older brothers who knew their way around a wrench. And so I observed a little of that, and I learned a few things along the way. And the things that they passed on to me, I passed on to my friend Mike. For example, it's February in South Dakota, which means if it's a positive number, it's not a very big number on the thermostat, or on the thermometer. Okay, so we are on our way to school about 7 o'clock on a very brisk, snowy February morning, and we were carpooling together. Mike's car was in the shop. That's another story for another time, and yes, it was not a great shining moment for Mike. But he's riding with us, and we're in my 72 Buick on the way to school and really excited just to be out, the three of us together on a snowy morning, because we always left early on snowy mornings. And you might think because we were wise enough to make a slow trip in the snow and ice. But the truth was, we would love to get out in the snow and ice and drive circles around in roads, not necessarily parking lots, sometimes yards, not always on purpose. But we loved winter driving. And so we're on our way, and we're about a half a mile to the school, and I fake like my car has something wrong with it, and I pull over the side of the road and just, shut it down or whatever, and Ian's like, oh no, what's going on? He was in the back seat. Mike was in the passenger seat, and I said, I don't know. Hey, Mike, you want to pop the hood? I've been having problems with the radiator belt fluid lately. And Mike gets out of the car to go check the radiator belt fluid. And we drove off to school. February, probably single digits outside. But he had a jacket, so he was probably okay. Actually, we went about 2 blocks, turned around, came back and picked him up. And he would not believe how angry he was at us. And we were great, high school guys. We were super nice to him about it. We're like, Mike, there's no such thing as a radiator belt, so why would it need fluid? And he's like, I don't know. I thought that sounded strange, but I know there's belts, I know there's radiators, and I know there's fluid, so I just thought I would look, It turned out he was more upset about that than I really understood. See, we kept rubbing it in that he wasn't really great at vehicles. For example, the time when we were driving in his pickup, he was driving, had a cast on one of the arms. That's a story for another day, but he was at Johnson Sighting the first time that he did a lead climb, and he got almost to the top of this cliff, and he thought, you know what? I haven't fallen yet, and I want to see if this protection is going to hold and if it will really catch me. Because I made it to the top without falling, but trying to learn how to place protection. Well, most guys would try that lower down on the cliff, not at the top. And so Mike did that, and he jumped back on it, and the first one almost held, and the rest of them didn't even come close. And so he broke his arm. Fortunately, it was about a 75-foot drop that was slowed a little bit as each piece gave way. But so he's driving his pickup with a 3 on the tree, and he's got a broken right arm. And so to shift on the 3 on the tree, you need one of 2 things: good friends who will shift for you, or just to be really talented to be able to shift and maneuver the steering wheel at the same time, especially when trying to turn. And so one night, we were out doing what my parents told us never to do after midnight. Nothing good happens after midnight. But we had gotten off work, and we were out cruising the strip like we should not have been. Mike was driving his pickup. I was in the middle. Ian was passenger, which, you know how to do this, right? You've done this, guys, probably like you're out cruising and you want to impress people. And so you pull up at the traffic light and the guy in the passenger seat ducks all the way down, leaving the two friends side by side. You probably did that a time or two. And they spend their whole time yelling at you or trying to yell to the girls next door. It's not really, this is not really happening type thing. Or maybe you don't yell that, I don't know. Things change over the years. But here we are, we pull up right out in front of the hospital, and the light is red, and I say, go right, go right, go right, go right. Because, you know, it's a red light. Why wait for a red light when you could go right? And he starts to go right, and Ian says, no, go straight. And so he takes off and runs right through the red light. Right? Because I said go right, he starts to go right. Ian says go straight, the light didn't change. Fortunately, it was after midnight, so in that case, not everything totally bad happens, you know. There wasn't any traffic, so he pulled over and, man, he just let us have it. He's like, I'm done with this. You guys are always messing with me when I'm driving. And you got to remember, he couldn't shift, so this would not have been near as big of a deal if when he said, hey, put it in low, if I would have just went ahead and done that. But instead, I just kept saying, go right, go right, go right. I didn't help him shift. I was not a good friend. And the Bible tells you you're very fortunate to have good friends, but be careful of the fools. They're not friends at all. And I was not a good friend to Mike like he was to me. And boy, did he let us have it. Again, Proverbs 13:20, if you're still following. Walk with the wise and become wise. Associate with Corey and get in trouble. Or with fools and get in trouble. A couple other proverbs kind of jump off the page, or thoughts jump off the page to me. One of them is not found in the book of Proverbs, but it really is kind of a proverb. It's found in 1 Corinthians. In my head, I'm thinking this should be 2 Corinthians, but 1 Corinthians chapter 15. This is why I usually put them on the screen, but I'm trying to model for you that you can tell stories without PowerPoint. Yeah, I knew that wasn't right. That was Romans. Okay. Don't be fooled by those who say such things. For bad company corrupts good character. Now, in this case, Paul is actually talking to people who are saying foolish things about life and death and the afterlife and the resurrected body. But that principle, that powerful parable that good or bad character corrupts good, bad company corrupts good character, that's a principle that you can bank on. I was corrupting my friends. Fortunately, we lived through those things. Nobody died in the midst of some of the foolish things that we did. Proverbs, going back to the Proverbs, chapter 28. This is a proverb that I learned from my friends long before I learned it from the Proverbs. But it's just simply true. Young people who obey the law are wise. Those with wild friends bring shame to their parents. And my friend's parents had a little shame because I did wild things, not smart things. I've heard some of your stories. You're a lot like me. You've done a few wild things. Why are you pointing at yourself, John? I did not even say your name this morning. But we've had those moments, right, where we've done things that we regret and they didn't turn out great for our friends. Here's another story for you. Before I do that, I want to share two more passages. Turn back just one page, Proverbs 6, or a few pages, Proverbs 16. In Proverbs chapter 16, Verse 28. By the way, Proverbs 16, you'll probably hear me preach on a lot because I love that proverb. Proverbs 16:28, a troublemaker plants seeds of strife, and gossip separates the best of friends. When I think back, I wasn't exactly the kind of guy that walked around saying, hey, did you hear what happened to Mike? Or did you hear what happened to Ian? That's not the kind of friend I was. But gossip has a lot of different looks to it. And you'd think a guy that whose parents could only afford to buy him 2 friends, like me, Mike and Ian were good friends to me, but I wasn't always good friends to them. And I remember Ian was a little different. He had a cleft palate. He was born with a cleft palate, and he sometimes got made fun of in school. Can you imagine kids being rude and making fun of each other for unique birth attributes? I remember this one time, this girl that I thought was kind of cute. We had a class where Ian and I and her were in the same class together. And she turned around and said something super ugly to him. And it was basically about his face. And he didn't say a word back to her. She was a beautiful young girl. I don't really know what that means anymore. Like 15, almost all the girls really look alike depending on how much makeup and how much they spend on makeup, how much they spend on hair, how much, you know what I'm saying, like how much they invest in their looks. But basically, you know, they're all young. They're all just growing and discovering who they are and who they're going to be. But she had discovered makeup. And after school, Ian and I were talking, and I said, you know, Ian, I really should have stood up and said something to her. I used to think she was cute, but what I saw today was just pure ugliness. And he said, you know, I so bad wanted to say, who are you to talk, Mona Lisa? But that's not him. He's kind. He's careful with his words. He says good things. See, I'm a much better person having a friend like that. He was not a much better person from having a friend like me in that moment. I should have stood up and said something to him. But I failed to do that. Kind of reminds me of the next proverb, Proverbs 17, where verse 27, it says, a truly wise person uses few words. That was Ian. Person with understanding is even-tempered. That was him as well. I don't know if you're getting this yet, but our stories can teach us a lot about the Word of God, and the Word of God teaches us a lot about our story. God planted me amongst some friends that I needed to learn from, even though I thought I had a lot to teach them, especially when it came to the Bible. My friend Ian grew up in a home with very mixed up spiritual commitments. His dad, if you ever get to South Dakota, there's a great museum in the Black Hills called the Journey Museum. It's basically the story of Native Americans in the Dakotas. It's a great museum. Ian's dad developed that museum, was a curator of that museum, devoted his life to that museum. Come to think of it, during the pandemic, they might have shut it down. I think it might be closed for good. But his dad was totally into like Indian, Native American mystery religion. Mike grew up with parents that were somewhat believers, like they went to a community church, and probably a little more left-leaning than most of our churches would tend to be. Definitely outspoken on some of the modern issues of the day, so to speak. But he had a sense of who Jesus was and what the church was about. But he also had a sense for Buddhism that he developed in college, and he developed a real, I don't know, just kind of affinity for some of the mystery religions that are out there. And what I'm telling you is God used 2 people who do not believe and follow Jesus to teach me so much about himself. And I think it's really important that as we share stories with people that we listen to their stories first, and that we prioritize their stories, but that we share our stories in a way that's humble in a way that helps make a difference for them, a way that values the characters in our stories, the characters of the people around us by actually valuing the character of the people around us by actually listening to their stories. Proverbs 17:9 says this: "Love prospers when a fault is forgiven, but dwelling on it separates the closest of friends." Michael taught me what forgiveness was. When he didn't give up on the guys who sent him out on that February morning to check the radiator belt fluid, when he didn't give up on the guys that made fun of his driving and did everything we could to get him pulled over by the police as often as possible. And I haven't even started with the Boy Scout stories because those are too many to tell, and none of them really reflect the values of that organization well. But what I'm trying to tell you is that friendship is a valuable thing. The characters that God puts in our lives, He puts there for a reason, and we can learn from them. And so for me, this idea that love prospers when a fault is forgiven. Here's a question. Why aren't we more eager for the opportunity to forgive one another? If that's what really prospers our love or strengthens it, we should look forward to the opportunity to forgive one another. By the way, as your pastor, I just want you to know, you have lots of opportunities to forgive me along the way. I make huge mistakes, and I hope and pray that you will forgive me. And I want to do a good job of forgiving you when you also sometime, maybe eventually, need forgiveness as well. It builds close relationships when we let these principles soak in and lead us. I want to tell you another story. Go to the next slide if you would. So we grew up in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and our friendship was largely based on the time we spent outdoors with each other. I mean, the legal things that we did, or at least most of them were legal. But we grew up climbing together. Here's the odd thing. I learned to climb first. And that picture of Michael up on the left, that was on the front, actually that one's the centerfold of the National Geographic that featured a story about his climb at the Lost Arrow Spire, about 20 miles from K2, where he and a team were on a sponsored climb by Reebok and National Geographic to go in and climb, put up a free climb route on Lost Arrow Spire, where they spent 9 days in a blizzard on the side of the cliff, not knowing if they were coming down, where 9 climbers on K2, 20 miles away, were killed in the same blizzard. It's an amazing story. There's a great video about it and a wonderful story in National Geographic. I have never been on National Geographic, in part because I was a lousy climber compared to Michael. And I also taught Ian how to climb. The three of us climbed together. They were way better than me, and I loved it because I got to see things and do things I never would have had the chance to do otherwise. There's this one day, though, that I really had a hard time forgiving them for. For the most part, these are the most loyal people I've ever known in my life, and yet on this particular day, we were climbing a place that we had climbed many times before, and both of them had mastered the moves on Super Crack. They could practically climb it with their eyes closed. But I would get about 3/4 of the way up to the crux move of the whole climb, and for some reason, my left foot didn't go up by my left ear like theirs did. And the courage to lunge and leap and hope to grab this handhold with your fingers, I just didn't have that courage. And so it wasn't unusual for me to get to that spot in the climb and for them to lower me back down. And so this day I decided I am going to make this move if it kills me. Well, not if it kills me, but even if it means falling down and letting them catch me on the rope. And it was about 3/4 of the way up this climb. It happened to be the same climb that Michael fell down and broke his arm on. And so I'm about 3/4 of the way up. The climb is called Super Crack. It's at Johnson Siding, and it's all cracks. And you just put your fingers in. That's why I have terrible arthritis these days. But put your fingers in, twist, and it's supposed to hold. Or you grab a flake, and it's supposed to hold. And I just didn't have the courage to do that like my friends did. Fortunately, it was a top rope problem. So you actually had your belay people at the top of the cliff, and they'd lower a rope down. You could walk around the edge and sit up there. Or in their case, they'd just climb up and wait for me. Well, on this day, I decide I'm going to make a move. I'm going to try this move, and I'm going to do it right away. I'm not going to wait, because usually what would happen is I'd get up there, and for about 10 minutes, I'd be there, and I'd start to do this. My body would get tired, and it'd shake. I don't know if that's exactly what happened to you when you were climbing last week or a couple of weeks ago and fell, but it's a terrible feeling when your body starts to shake loose. And so I'm thinking, I'm going to go right away this time. So about 5 or 10 minutes later, I decide I'm going to go right away this time and make this move. And I get ready to make the move, and I finally get the confidence, and I lunge, and I catch it, and I pull myself up. And I'm looking, and the rope is dangling below me. And so I move up another 4 or 5 feet, and I yell, "Rope!" And what that means is the person at the top is supposed to take the rope up so that if you fall, you don't fall very far. And it continued to dangle below me, and I climb up a little bit farther, and rope, nothing. So I get almost to the top of this cliff, and now I've got about 30 feet of rope below me, which means I wouldn't have fallen to the bottom of the cliff, but I would have fallen about 65 feet, Like, what is going on? Rope! And I get to the top, and there's nobody at the top. There's nobody on the other end of the rope. They have tied off the rope on a tree, and they both went down to the car below. They were taking pictures and sipping soda because I never made the move before. They just figured it was going to be like every other time, and they'd have to lower me down. But they both went down to the car, and they're sitting there, and they're just laughing at me. I'm like, what kind of friends are you? I mean, this is literally life or death. And my friends leave me hanging. They're the most loving, loyal people I've ever known in my life. Eventually, I would forgive them for that moment, but it took a while. They said, "Well, we didn't figure you were going to go. And we knew we didn't have time to get back up there, so we figured, well, you're on our own. If nothing else, we're down here to get emergency treatment to you quickly." And it was that day that I kind of discovered this truth from the book of Proverbs, chapter 18, verse 24. There are friends who destroy each other, but a real friend sticks closer than a brother. I like another translation that says, there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. I put a lot of faith in these guys. As a matter of fact, that bottom picture wasn't that long ago. It was during the pandemic when I had lost my job, when we were like, what are we going to do? And frightened by the pandemic like you. Michael was off in Wyoming, Ian's up in Montana. We're a long way from each other, but those guys met with me online once a week. And we just confided in each other and supported one another. And that love and loyalty spoke into my heart and my life in huge ways. And I don't know where my life would be without those guys. But here's the thing. They've left me hanging. And our friendships will leave us hanging, but there's a friend that sticks closer than a brother. And that little proverb means so much to me, because I was the youngest of my 3 brothers. You know what that means? Yeah, the oldest in the room are saying, yes, it means that you had the easy life. And the youngest in the room are right. It meant I was always picked on, right, by my older brothers. Maybe you've been down that road. But I'm glad there's a friend that sticks closer than a brother, and I'm glad it's not just other people. It's this God who is amazing in what he does and how he treats us and the chance that he gives us over and over again. Another story I want to tell you about was a climbing story. This one takes place at Raspberry Rocks, which I tried to find a good picture of. There's not a good picture of Raspberry Rocks. But it's this amazing place. If you've ever been to the Black Hills and you had the privilege to drive on Iron Mountain Road, one of my favorite roads next to the Needles Highway, that's by far my favorite, but there's this place, and maybe you've seen a picture of it or a postcard if nothing else. Have you ever been to Mount Rushmore, or at least heard of Mount Rushmore, right? Okay, so there's this picture on a postcard that you can see where there's a tunnel, and Mount Rushmore is in the middle of this picture. And that takes place on Iron Mountain Road. And if you keep driving on that road the other direction from the monument, you eventually go down and you get to like an area called Legion Lake, which is just gorgeous. And we parked there, and we had read about this place to go climbing in an international climbing magazine, and it was right in our backyard. Never heard of it. We thought we knew every place to climb. And by every place, I mean in nature and every building, any place that we could. You know, we were always trying to do that. But we go down to this area by Legion Lake, and we hike back up into the woods, and it opens up into like this meadow, and there's this huge boulder field. And above the boulder field are these cliffs. And it's just a gorgeous view, especially in the fall. And we get up there, and we'd heard about this thing, and there were top rope opportunities. And we decided we weren't familiar with this area to just do a lead climb up it. So Ian and Mike, who were faster and better climbers, they took off around to get around to the edge and left me with all the gear. And I'm just kind of bored and waiting, and I'm not the brightest bulb in the pack. And I'm looking, and I'm like, that doesn't look that hard to climb. I'm the worst climber of the three of us. Both of them thought it was hard to climb. That should have been a hint to me. Don't do this. But they take off, and I've been waiting over an hour. And they were supposed to just go around, and I don't know what we were thinking because they didn't even have a rope with them. We weren't, like I said, super sharp. We were teenage boys. And but I got tired of waiting, and I discovered, hey, I have all the ropes, all the equipment. I'm just going to climb up, and this will be hilarious. I'm going to climb up, and I'm going to meet them there at the top. So I start to climb. I get about halfway up this 125-foot climb, and I made the mistake of looking down. I don't know if I told you I'm afraid of heights. Did I tell you that? I don't think I told you that. Which, the only thing that I hate more than heights are snakes. And this area was kind of known for rattlesnakes. And so my imagination starts running wild. And I'm about halfway up. I get to this ledge, and I just stand there frozen. I cannot see a way up. I cannot. Did you know it's harder to climb down than up? You probably know that, right? You've done this. I can't climb down. I can't climb up. I'm in the middle of a rock. So what would you do? Well, you pull out your cell phone. This was 1985. Those walls had to have cords on them. So I'm just sitting there, yelling. And when I get scared, I sing. I sang every youth group song I could think of. I sang every prayer to God that I could. And I kind of figured it was the end of things, so there were a few conversations that we had in the moment there as I sat there on the edge of this cliff. And I'm yelling, and they can't hear me up above. And I sat on the edge of that cliff. It had to be at least 2 hours. Hadn't heard from them. Finally, one of them comes down around and spots me from below. They'd been yelling from above. I couldn't hear them. They couldn't hear me. Here I am halfway up the cliff, and they rescued me. And I was a mess. In my whole life, all I've ever wanted to do is rescue them, kind of return the favor. When I was young, I thought that meant telling them everything I knew about Jesus and proving that I was right. Have you ever been that way with a friend? It's not a good way to be with a friend. What that meant with Michael is we'd go out camping and we'd talk all night long about God. And he's the one that helped me develop my beliefs in God because he didn't have strong beliefs in God. And we would just argue back and forth. And you know what? You can't win an argument. I'm just telling you, it's like fighting with your wife. Even if you prove yourself to be right about God, that doesn't mean that you're going to have any more affection for him. That doesn't mean they're necessarily going to put their trust in him. I even went this far. I went so far as to tell Michael about a dream I had had. I don't even know if I had the dream. I was just trying to win the argument. And he was trying to figure out, why is this so important to you that I believe everything you believe? Now I know that that's easy. I'm a fool. If I think that he's going to believe everything I believe about God, I'm a fool. I'm an arrogant fool. I would have been way better off just listening to his beliefs and asking him questions. But instead, I tried to convince him, and I told him this dream I had had, which I'm sure I probably heard somebody else tell this dream. And I thought, oh, that'll be convincing to him. I said, yeah, but Michael, I had this dream, and we're standing in a line for, we both died, and we're standing in the line for judgment, and you're standing in the line to hell, and I'm standing in the line to heaven, and you come out of line, and you just, why didn't you tell me? That's a pretty impactful dream, right? But I'm sure what he heard in that moment is, Michael, you're going to hell. And even if I believe that, the audacity and the arrogance to simply think that I can win an argument and get him in the right line, or that he's going to come into line with my line of thinking because I had a dream. You know a better way to do that? Trust that God put people, the characters in your life for a purpose. Trust that God is going to grow you through them, that you can learn from them, that you're not just the one that's the authority teaching. Trust that God knows what he's doing when he plants you in those friendships. And you have the opportunity to forgive, like we have the opportunity to forgive, and like the Proverbs says, that's the way to develop close, sincere friendship. Model that type of love. I don't know that I shared this one with you yet. I don't think I have. Proverbs 17:17. Not far from the one that I just read, but this is one of my new favorites, even though it's an old one. A friend is always loyal, and a brother is born to help in a time of need. There are a couple other great translations to that, but you know what word shows up in that, Proverbs 17:17? It's a word we started this series with, hesed. That the idea here is that when you have that God-type love, that loyal love, that steadfast love, you're so fortunate. But the second half of this proverb, basically, this is a strange translation in the NLT, but it's basically saying, but where can you find that kind of love in human beings? And the reality is, I love my friends, and they've taught me so much about love and loyalty and friendship, but they can never replace my Jesus. And I just want to close today with his words and his thoughts briefly about friendship, and then I'm going to let you hear a song from a friend of mine. In John chapter 15, Jesus has this conversation about the vine. You remember that one? And in the middle of the conversation about the vine, he talks about, I no longer call you servants, but I call you my friend. When you do what I tell you, I call you my friend. See, here's the thing. Friendship was God's idea first. His great wisdom tells us that we should value our friends and that we can learn a lot from our friends, and we can teach a lot to our friends by the way we act, whether we act foolishly or we act in loyalty. I'm not sure what has kept my friends connected to me, but I know why I'm connected to them. They still believe in me. They still love me despite my faults and my failures. They have that type of loyalty that friendship models. And when Jesus is looking for a model to talk about intimacy with God and intimacy with him, the model he uses for us is friendship. If you have a friend that you value, will you thank God for that relationship? Because that friendship is designed to teach you something. God has planted that friend in your life and planted you in that friend's life so that you will listen and you will be loyal and you will love that person, that you might learn more about God from that person, and that you might teach more about God to that person by the way that you love them well. This morning, I want to just end with this video. David Bidell was one of my partners in my previous job. David was working on reaching New York City. This year, in the past 5 years, they've been doing this thing called Jesus Week in New York City. Small churches like ours. David pastors at a small church, or he did. And he networked with small churches all over New York City, and specifically in the Staten Island area, to just love well the neighbors around them. And I want you to see this video for two reasons. One is I want to give you a vision of what a small church can do in a large community. Second, during a pandemic, by the way. Second, I want you to hear the message of the song that David wrote. And let's just play the video if you would, please.